Hello and welcome to the Japan Society. I'm Daniel Rosenblum. Japan's general election on August 30th could bring about momentous change if the long-ruling Liberal Democratic Party is driven from power by the opposition Democratic Party of Japan. Just what would such a historic change mean for Japan's economic policies, its foreign policies, and in particular, its relations with the United States? Well, to discuss these and other questions, we're pleased to welcome Ed Lincoln. Ed is the director of the Center for Japan-U.S. Business and Economic Studies at the New York University's Stern School of Business. Well, welcome, Ed.
Thank you, Dan.
It seems increasingly the polls and the pundits are expecting that the Democratic Party is going to win this election. To what extent is the current economic downturn in Japan likely to play a role in the outcome of this key vote?
Well, it certainly plays some role. People have been hurt pretty badly. The downturn has been going on now for 3 consecutive quarters. The drop at the end of last year and the first quarter of this year were very large, at a 14% annualized rate. Unemployment is going up, employment is going down, wages are being cut. So people are clearly hurting. The puzzling part, though, is that in the past, often when it came to an election time, people would seem to have the reaction that they would rather stick with the politicians who had long experience in running the government rather than bringing in a new set of politicians to run the government. This time around, that doesn't seem to be happening, and so maybe there is a shift in thinking and saying, well, these guys have screwed up in handling the economic situation.
Well, Ed, the Democratic Party victory in the election would end half a century of nearly unbroken rule by the business-friendly Liberal Democratic Party. What impact would a Democratic Party victory have on Japan's macroeconomic policies?
Not a whole lot, because the starting point is that the Liberal Democratic Party has already taken some major steps. Japan, like the United States, put in place a rather substantial fiscal stimulus package. They did it in 3 pieces late last year, early this year. So they have taken some steps. Not as dramatic as, say, the UK, but they've been more proactive on fiscal policy than, say, France or Germany. So they have done some things. The Democratic Party of Japan says it will do more. They're proposing additional stimulus that would amount to about 2% of GDP, both 2009 and again in the 2010 fiscal year. So if they could get that through, which is an entirely different question, we would be seeing more fiscal stimulus coming out of them.
Well, you know, speaking of that, I think some worry that the Democrats, if they do gain power, they would spend aggressively to get the country out of recession and push up Japan's already huge public deficit, which could in turn raise bond yields. Is this scenario a realistic one? Does it worry you?
No, not at all. It hasn't been for the past 15 to 20 years as that debt was getting bigger and bigger. Interest rates on Japanese government bonds are running about 1.5%, very low. This is long-term bond rate. Short-term rates are even lower. So Japan certainly has no problem floating larger bond issues going into the near future. And what's really important is getting the economy growing again. Then they can worry about bringing the deficit back down and cut off the growth in the total debt level. But that's really not an issue.
Well, to accomplish all that needs to be done, though, the Democrats, if they do win, they're going to have to put together a coalition government. How difficult is this going to be for them?
Well, the precedent we have was 1993, when the LDP fell from power, not because they really got pushed out by the voters, but because some 55 members of the LDP just walked out of the party, led out by Mr. Ozawa. At that time, the coalition that came into power, I think, had 6 parties in it. And it was difficult. It was the only unifying theme they had was, this is our one and only chance, and we got to make this work. And they actually managed to do it. This time around, probably they can get away with forming a coalition with only one or two minor parties. There aren't as many, there isn't as much splintering with sizable blocks of votes in other parties. So I think the task will be a little bit easier than it was back in 1993. And of course, it does also depend on what the election outcome is. It is conceivable that they could win enough votes to have a majority on their own in the lower house. And so it would be less critical for them to form a coalition.
Well, the Democrats have also pledged to emphasize the rights of individuals and workers over the rights of corporations. What are the implications of this for, so-called corporate Japan?
Well, not all that bad. I would be a little reluctant to cast this in terms of sort of big companies supporting the LDP versus the DPJ standing up for the little guy. And the specifics of what they're proposing are things like a corporate tax cut for small business. Well, a lot of small business in Japan actually produces the components that get sold to big business in Japan. So I think big business wouldn't object to that too much. The one piece of their platform that does worry me, and quite frankly would worry me even if the LDP were staying in power, and that is labor markets. When you have a slow-growing economy, you have to have flexibility in your workforce, right? That companies need to be able to shed workers in bad times. And of course, you do want to provide a social safety net for those workers, but if you can't just saddle companies with these fixed labor expenses. Over the past 10 years, the way Japanese companies have tried to cope with that need for flexibility is to hire more temporary and part-time workers. These workers are considered not to be covered by Japanese law and the interpretation of that law by the courts that makes it extremely difficult to fire regular full-time employees. So we now have a somewhat bifurcated labor market in which some workers do have this essential lifetime guarantee up to the retirement age, and other workers have no guarantee. Well, of course, in this downturn, the sense has been that these temporary and part-time workers are being laid off, which is why companies hired them in the first place. And this has created a big uproar in the Japanese media. The solution of the DPJ is to say, oh, let's give those workers, the temps and the part-timers, the same job guarantee that regular full-time workers have. That would not be good for Japan. What ought to happen is the reverse, that regular full-time workers have their job guarantee stripped away. And so that everybody is subject to the same uncertainty about their employment, rather than giving some workers a big guarantee and others none. So on that, I'm afraid the DPJ is going the wrong way, and this is not a business-friendly policy.